Hello and welcome to Mapping the College Audition, a podcast where we explore the landscape of the college theater world and try to demystify this daunting audition process. I'm your host, Charlie Murphy, director of MTCA, that's Musical Theater College Auditions, and today we have got a gorgeous beachside show lined up for you. Nick Hollamby from the Institute of the Arts Barcelona is on the pod today. We've had Nick participate in our private MTCA walk-in auditions, and he just could not be a nicer guy, including multiple times inviting us out there to come visit, which I'm just going to say, if you see a future months-long gap in podcasts because I'm lying on a beach somewhere, you know who to blame. Nick and I get into today the specifics of IAB and the challenges of an international program. And at the end, we get into some specifics of his own research, including on transitioning voices and global musical theater. And that's something I'm going to try to do more of on future episodes, which is alongside getting to know the programs, I'm going to try to continue delving into interesting topics that are specific to these professors when they come up. So that's something I've certainly been trying to do already, but I'm just going to keep massaging that a little bit further. So of course, I'm going to still try to have an open forum for each of the schools, so you can hear what each school is like in a pretty parallel manner, but hopefully we can also keep having interesting discussions that illuminate more of the map of this process. Speaking of all over the map, where were all of your Thanksgivings? Were they lovely? We sure had a great one. We were in Chicago, just so close to Meghan. I should have reached out to her, but just the in-laws, blah, blah, blah. Solvi loved hanging out with her cousins. I got to enjoy some rest and some time away from the computer, as well as, I'm going to say, some blessedly low-stress travel, which feels like it's in short supply these days. It's important to be grateful for the things that don't happen, too. Like, we didn't have a travel disaster. It's always hard to remember that. Like, when you miss a subway car, you're like, God, so unlucky. You don't think about all the lucky times you just caught the subway car. Speaking of lucky, there is still just a little bit of time for you to sign up for our junior kickoff event, which is coming up this weekend. Unlike that workshop webinar where many of you attended, which was so nice, you got to meet me and discuss the process. This will be actual artistic classes in each of these fields. So there'll be an acting class, a singing class, a dancing class, and then an additional informational meeting with me and our other director, Leo. This takes place both online and in person in New York City. This event, unlike that workshop, which is really a chance to meet us, this event is intended for our MTCA students, so many of our MTCA students will be there, but also open to the public. If you want to use it as a chance to get to know us, that is totally fine. There will be a link with details in the show notes of this very episode that you're listening to. All right, well, let's kick off this interview with the charming Nick Hollamby from IAB. Well, we are so honored to have Nick Hollamby of the Institute of the Arts Barcelona on the pod today. Nick has a Bachelor of Music from Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University, that's in Australia, and a Master's of Music Study in Vocal Pedagogy from that same Queensland Conservatorium. He was the head of the program at the National Academy of Singing and Dramatic Arts in New Zealand. As a researcher, he's studying some really cool stuff we may talk about today, of the evolution of contemporary commercial music. He's talking about transgender vocal development, vocal rehabilitation, very interesting stuff. And he is now the head of the program here at the Institute of the Arts Barcelona, which is in Sitges, Barcelona, Spain. They offer class sizes of about 45 people. They offer Bachelor of Arts with honors, a BA Hons in musical theater, in acting, in dance, and in commercial dance. Nick, welcome on the pod. How are you feeling today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you for that introduction.
Of course. For those who are just listening, you're missing a true visual. You may have to. This may be one you have to look at YouTube, because Nick not only is giving us beauty with the pocket square, he's got a gorgeous background. The presentation is top notch. The plating we're really appreciating from Nick. But Nick, if you just give us a little catch up. So I gave you a short bio there, of course, on you, but is there any other like tidbits or fun facts or other helpful info from our listeners just to kind of know about your own background and what your journey was to IAB?
For sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, I was born and I trained in Australia in both jazz and musical theatre. And I spent a lot of my time, I guess my formative years as a performer and as a musician, as a singer in Australia, studying the art form and certainly I guess understanding the narrative from an Australian perspective, the
Mm-hmm.
musical theatre narrative from an Australian perspective. And at the time when I was there, it was very much heavily influenced by the UK and the US musical theatre system, which is fantastic and gave us really strong groundings. From there, I moved to New Zealand, and then, I mean, that's only a 4-hour flight away from where I was in Brisbane, but a very different industry in New Zealand, a much smaller industry, but a really exciting industry for new works, new development. And so that gave me a different perspective once again, particularly with the engagement with the Pacifica communities, the Maori community from New Zealand. So looking at different perspectives and narratives within musical theatre there. And then here I am in Spain, and we have where I'm working at the Institute of the Arts Barcelona, as you mentioned, with students from over 50 different nationalities. So we have different perspectives, again, for musical theatre from all over the world here. And so, yeah, I think it's been a really interesting journey to this point. Certainly not the usual trajectory of the traditional process, but I guess that international perspective has put me in good stead for working with the students here at the IAB.
Totally. And we're going to dive deep into the program. But before that, I have to derail us a little bit because I was helping my partner work an audition where she had to do a New Zealand accent. And I was trying to demonstrate the New Zealand accent, and she didn't believe me. She was like, she thought I was like mocking her. I was like, I may be doing it badly, but it's very, do you do a good New Zealand? Can we see a little bit?
I would love to say that I do, but my wife is a Kiwi.
Can't do it.
Okay, so I guess the big difference for me moving from Australia to New Zealand was the word pen.
Yeah.
P-E-N.
Pin.
And then they say pin. Yes.
Yeah.
Can I have a pin, please?
Yeah.
And so that I vowel used to throw me all the time. Every time someone would say, do you have a pin? I would think, what?
We have that in the American South too. We do that pin-pen substitution here. But I could only do the voice like in a very high-pitched voice. I think that's why she thought I was mocking it. Because I could only do it like this. And she was like, it can't be. I was like, I don't know. It's pinched. I'm trying to do my best here.
I think it's challenging, but you're smashing it. That's great.
Thank you. We'll start with compliments. Okay, let's get into your wonderful program. And you mentioned 50 different nationalities. That's incredible. If you were to try to sum up, and of course there's not one kind of student, but if you were to try to sum up, like, what do you think it means to be an IAB student? What does it feel like? What are the things that you feel like, across the board, we tend to have students who are what?
I think for IAB students, particularly if we're focusing on the music theatre program, they are looking at the global industry as opposed to working towards, say, a more traditional pathway of wanting to go do national tours, Broadway, West End sort of shows. And I certainly think that was how the IAB formed. We had a lot of UK students, but now because of the number of nationalities that we have, we're preparing students for the stages around the world. So we're not just looking at one sort of pathway or end platform. So I guess a global student is probably the best way to describe that.
Well, and I ask this question often later of like, where do your students come from and where do they end up? When you say 50 nationalities, is it mostly European nationalities? I mean, what does that actually look like in terms of the percentages? I know you may not know exactly, but the general percentages of what's coming in.
For sure, yeah. I mean, a lot of our students come from the European continent. So we have a lot of students from Portugal, particularly in musical theatre. Musical theatre is really strong in Portugal, and they're producing some amazing performers. But then, of course, we have them from across the UK. We have from Bulgaria, the Middle East, as far-reaching as the Philippines, and of course the US and South America as well. So it's a real mix. But I guess, as you say, the majority of our students do come from Europe.
And does that mean, so are all of your classes taught in English, or are there some classes that are dual language classes where you go, we're going to experiment with some of these other languages?
Yeah, for sure. So the entire program, because we're accredited by Liverpool John Moores University, so it's a UK degree, everything is taught and assessed in English. Having said that, because we're encouraging students to return back to whether it's Brazil or Bulgaria, Croatia, to perform in their home countries, we do encourage the students to embrace their native language and to embrace that in their performance. So there are outlets and avenues within their studies here to perform and demonstrate that.
Super cool. Well, let's talk through the 3 years. And I do want to talk a little bit about that also, that 1-year certificate program that you offer. But let's talk about the 3 years, imagining many of our students, of our MTCA students are looking at doing those full programs. Yeah. What would those 3 years look like in terms of the musical theater training and how much acting I'm taking, singing, dancing, and what that would be structured throughout the year.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So I guess the closest I can liken the BA Honours musical theatre program to is a BFA in the States, because it's highly vocational. It's I guess 80% practical, 20% theoretical. So across the 3 years, it's a traditional triple threat training, I guess, in the traditional sense of the training methods that we have. And it would be reflective, I guess, of most of the music theatre courses across the States and in the UK. So there's the acting, singing and dance foundations. But we split students in first year between a dance extension and a singing extension. I'll get into that in a second. But acting is at
extension would be more like a major for the US audiences?
Yeah, I guess it would be more like I mean, there's no difference in the degree in the piece of paper that you get at the end, with as far as majors are concerned. But the extension sort of just pushes you in the areas that you're stronger and develops the areas that you still need to work on. So by the end of third year, everyone is at a similar level. So yeah, I guess acting is at the forefront of everything that we do, of course, and it's the foundation of what we have. And students will receive acting for straight plays and also musical theatre in their first 2 years. And by third year, they're looking at more TV, film, acting as well, just to diversify their skill set. And then alongside that, particularly because of the nature of what our students want to achieve, even though they're from 50 different nationalities, the big goal is always the Broadway or West End stage. And so there is the voice and dialect, which sits underneath that. So they work on accents and voice production within those acting modules. Within their singing modules, they receive one-to-one lessons throughout the year. They receive repertoire classes where they build their repertoire book and study new composers, different works, acting through song classes as well, and massed ensemble singing throughout their singing. If they're on the singing extension, they also receive a vocal styles module delivery, which is, I guess, looking at pop, rock, jazz, R&B, soul music, just to give those students on the singing extension a little bit more additional strings to their bow, if you will. Those on the dance extension will get that, but only in their third year, whereas the singing extension will study that throughout their degree.
And as you break that down, are you thinking that the singing extension people are the people who are stronger singers? That you might be a professional singer-actor, and we want your dance to be strong, but we think, let's really know this is what's getting you in the room? Or is it the opposite, that it's the weakness where you say, hey, you really need this help?
Yeah, no, you nailed it the first time. That's definitely the ones that come in with strong singing backgrounds, strong singer actors, as well as those that might not have had as much dance experience, because whether it was accessible to them or they just hadn't had that opportunity, we can put them on the singing extension pathway and allow them to build their dance skills.
And then by converse, the dance classes for those students might be a little bit lower level than the dance extension students.
Yep. Yeah,
correct. That makes sense. And then what about, so we mentioned those different degrees. You can get the BA with Hons in musical theater. Probably not with Hons. It's a BA Hons or with honors is probably how I should be saying it.
But Bachelor of Arts with Honors, yeah.
Yeah. But then how does the interaction work with the actors or the dancers in terms of do the majors overlap at all? Do they take classes together, or is it really separate programs?
For sure, yeah. There's two extensions work together in a lot of different modules. So I guess modules are probably similar. Do you call them courses in the States?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So the modules are like courses. So I guess that within their music theatre repertoire ensemble, for instance, they will join together and work on production numbers from well-known musicals. For their productions themselves, they do 2 musicals in second year and 2 musicals in their third year. They'll all work together. They all audition for the same shows. For all their music theatre history classes, for their music theory classes, for their professional studies classes, which looks at mental health, vocal health, physical health, and well-being, for their industry prep. It's all combined. So the only times that they really split is between those dancing and singing papers.
So that's closer to what we would maybe call a major, in that way of you're an acting major, a dance major, a musical theater major. You're all in the same school together, but then there's that focus even within that for the BA Hons musical theater, where you have the extension or whatever. It's like the sub-major.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
okay, I love it. Now we're parsing our language here. Let's talk about the kind of how you prepare your students for the launch into the business. So after that third year, whether I want to go to Broadway, whether I want to go to the West End, what are we learning in terms of audition prep or just also business, the business kind of stuff?
For sure. So our degree has a module that runs right through all 3 years in the same way that they have the dance, singing and acting modules. They have a professional studies module. So in first year, you're looking at, as I mentioned before, well-being. So that's looking at mental, physical and vocal well-being to prepare you for not only your studies, but for the industry. By second year, that then develops into industry studies. So you start to look at key individuals within the industry. For those that are coming from the UK, they'll look at particular theatre companies, producers, and likewise with those from the States. And then by the time they go into third year, it's preparing them for the grind of auditions. So you'll do weekly mock auditions with both guests and internal staff. You'll put together your CVs, get your headshots done. There's a full industry showcase where we invite producers, casting directors, and agents from across Europe. And we also send the material, of course, to the States for those students that are coming across from the US. And so that whole module system works towards getting the students industry ready.
Totally makes sense. And then what about, are they taking any other classes? So am I getting anything else in the, so if I'm doing a lot of acting, singing, dancing, am I doing any English classes or any, normal college kind of stuff?
So because of the nature of the degree, and I guess in a lot of countries, an honours degree will run for 4 years, whereas we've condensed ours into 3. So unfortunately, I guess not unfortunately, but we really try to focus on the key content of what they're going to need once they get into the industry. Having said that, because of the location, and for the majority of our students, they do move to Spain, you can study Spanish in your first year. There are a lot of cultural activities and events that take place here to embrace the wider community, both within the wider Spain, but also within Catalonia, where we're located. And so I guess for the students, outside of their music theatre training, they can take part in those events. For our music theatre students, they can also talk to those on the Bachelor's with Honours dance programs, the commercial dance or contemporary dance, as well as the acting programs, and work with the specialists that come in for those programs, so they get different perspectives there.
And it seems like, so for your school, in terms of like the campus experience, right? It seems like there's no on-campus housing is what I see. So that means you'd have to kind of like you're sort of living in an apartment, or you're figuring it that's a little kind of New York style. Sometimes New York schools, it's like you're living on the 3rd Avenue and you're like, okay, here we go. But so you're figuring out your own thing, and you're I imagine also experiencing some of Barcelona. Can we talk a little bit about what that experience is, just in terms of living, especially for our US students who are going, what would that even be like?
Yeah, for sure.
I'd love to hear some of that.
Yeah, so we're located about 30 minutes south of Barcelona by train or bus, and we're on a beachside town. So the campus is 2 minutes walk from the beach, and it's quite a small community of about 30,000 people, quite a large expat community. So I guess for those that are contemplating studying abroad, there's English is still spoken throughout the community. Like I said, we encourage students to develop their love and understanding of the Spanish and Catalan culture, but you can certainly get by throughout the 3 years with limited Spanish understanding. The campus, as you mentioned, we have 2 campuses. The main campus is quite close to a place called Utopia, which is a fitting name for a accommodation for students where they can stay, and that's between our campus and the beach. So a lot of our students will stay in Utopia for their first year, but then, as you mentioned, they'll move into apartment living in Sitges, and there's lots of apartments, and our student services team do a really great job of finding housing and apartments for the students when they arrive in Sitges.
So cool. So, and like, do the students do a lot of like interacting in the broader, Barcelona community? Like, are they putting up shows there? Are they doing, like, how does that work in terms of their integration, especially imagining people who speak only English? How does that work in terms of how they're able to integrate?
So within the program, a lot of our students will go out and perform we will run our productions in some of the large theatres in Barcelona and surrounding towns. We also invite because there's a large music theatre scene within Spain itself, we invite a lot of creatives to work on the productions here from around Spain. So I guess the students get to immerse themselves in the Spanish music theatre scene as well. Having said that, there's lots of different festivals. I mean, the Spanish, for those that have travelled to Spain or know anything about the Spanish and Catalan communities, they love to celebrate everything. So every weekend there's a different festival or celebration on. So we've just had the film festival, which is one of the biggest horror film festivals in the world, that was in Spain or in Sitges, I should say, and the students were involved in that. There's a wine festival. There's
which the students were not
arts
involved
festival.
in the wine festival, right?
No.
Not at all. No, actually allowed over there. You actually could have been. Parents, don't listen to this part.
Oh, that's exactly right. I guess the students embrace the culture activities in the wider community, but also within their program, they're also engaging with Barcelona and the wider Spanish scene.
And then we talked about, where the students come from, and again, I know you don't know exact percentages, but where does it tend that students end up? Do many end up back in the UK? Do many, if they're US students, do they often go back to the US and work? I guess, do most people end up going back to where they came from? Or do some of them stay in Spain? How does it work if I were someone, because I am maybe that student who's saying, I'm interested in the global community. Maybe I'll say even specifically, I'm a US student and I'm interested in maybe staying in Europe, and what would that look like for me to work there? Like, how does that work if it happens at all?
Yeah, so I guess there's a 50-50 split for our students, especially those coming from the US or the UK, where visa, or people like myself from Australia, where visas for Europe can be challenging to access. But that is part of the third-year course. We do talk about visas and how to access those and who are the right people to speak to. But a lot of our students will fall in love with Europe when they come here. So we have a number of US students in our third-year cohort who, at the start, were planning to go straight back to the US and audition for national tours and things like that. But now are contemplating maybe staying in Spain for a year or two to try their hand at the European scene. Others will go into cruise ship auditions and do cruise tours. Others will do Australasian tours and things like that around the world. So I guess as part of their industry week that they have with the showcase, we have lots of casting directors that are casting for productions all over the globe. So students end up getting a lot of work through that platform.
And how does it work? I mean, in terms of, I know, so you have the student visa. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the legal logistics, but just, I guess, how realistic is it for a US student to then be able to say, and then I want to stay for 5 years in Europe and work? Is that the kind of thing that's achievable? I know that people I've reported that can be a struggle sometimes, especially in the UK, to be like, they're a little bit like, get out, go. We want jobs for our UK people. So I'd love to hear about how that works.
Yeah, it is challenging, I guess, because the visa laws are constantly changing. But for our US students or any students that are coming from outside of Europe, their student visa will allow them to stay on, or they can extend their student visa afterwards. It's certainly not for a 5-year period, but within that time, once they extend, if they meet a producer or a casting director, particularly in Spain is developing their artist visa laws. And so they're developing ways for artists to be able to come and work in Spain because the industry is booming here. So for those that want to stay, they can be sponsored and then put onto a visa if they're lucky enough to get through that pathway.
And I've seen a lot of that on the reverse end of, some of our coaches who, from Europe or whatever, who've then tried to do and it's doable. It just seems like it's a lot of work. It's not an easy, like, just apply and you have it. You're like,
yeah, for sure. No, exactly.
What about the reverse where some of our American students who are like, I'm so excited about this. I love the idea of the global community. I love the idea of living in Spain on the beach for 3 years. I mean, a lot of our MTCA students who've ended up there, that is a hard lure to pull away from them.
Yeah.
But if they are thinking, and I've heard this fear with just any international school, to think, you mentioned we'll have the film showcase and that of course, the preparation is going to be good. But is there any kind of connections to U.S., agents, U.S. casting directors? How would they then be prepared if I want to then come do Broadway? How would I be prepared for the kind of the U.S. market?
For sure. We try to, because we have such a large number of US students now coming to the IAB, one of the musical productions, we try to have an American creative team each year. So this year, for instance, we're doing a production of Holiday Inn with our third years, and the director for that is Andy Signor Jr., who's a Broadway performer and director, who was the associate director for the Holiday Inn production on Broadway in 2016. And last year, he also directed On Your Feet, because we're lucky enough for Andy to be now living in Barcelona. So he's still constantly working in the US and traveling around the world. So we try to create connections through creatives. But then, of course, we have lots of Zoom or Skype calls with industry professionals in the States, just so the students feel like they've got that connection. Because as you say, 3 years in Europe is great, but if they're wanting to then return to the US, it's important that they have that real-time industry connection and feel like they've got their finger on the pulse for when they return.
Well, it's amazing also in through the pandemic, like the distance between Spain and New York versus, let's say, Chicago and New York became almost identical because that's basically how things were happening, and in some ways still happening. The episode that we're releasing this week, we talk with a manager who says, his client is now making their Broadway debut, and he's never met with her. He's like, I saw
Wow.
the showcase online. We've only had
Yeah.
meetings on Zoom, and she was in Chicago. She was went to Northwestern.
Amazing.
You go like, that's the way the world works sometimes now. Like,
Yeah.
just a different
And,
world.
there's been a huge shift, I think, for the industry, and certainly within education, we've seen at IAB, there's been a shift in the students that now are willing to travel overseas and study. I think it's sort of because of the lockdown and COVID and the global pandemic, we all became so close in a sort of digital way that idea of traveling and working with others from abroad is a little bit more accessible in some ways.
I love it. Let's talk about cost. So I'd love to hear kind of from a baseline cost, which, and if it's different from American students versus European students, to hear that too. And then also just a little bit about scholarship opportunities and realistically kind of what my net all-in cost is going to be if I'm going to end up at IIB.
For sure. So I'll talk about scholarships first and work backwards. So the scholarships, we have talent scholarships as part of the IAB offerings, and they're sort of given out as part of the audition process. Having said that, because we're aware that a lot of students are traveling from overseas, and because sometimes you can receive loans, but sometimes it depends on how your bank or the loan system works. Certainly for our US students, that's something to look into if you're wanting to study overseas in Spain, just making sure that the money that they have saved is not connected to only being able to study in the US. But we do have financial aid and financial support for those students that are interested in studying abroad within the program. As far as the fees are concerned, they're sort of, I'm just trying to see if I can work this out into US dollars.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm looking at a euro here and it means nothing to me. It could be double, triple, 1.5.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know where we're at the current state of the dollar.
Let me see if I can quickly tell you how much it's almost identical to the euro at the moment. So it's $15,500 US.
I don't know if that's good news or bad news for the dollar, but it's news of some kind. It used to be different somehow, I think. That's potentially before scholarships, and then
before exactly.
And
exactly.
What is a realistic? I mean, it's already a pretty low cost compared to some U.S. institutions. But what is a realistic? If I were to get a talent scholarship, you're really excited about me. It's like, would that be $3,000, $5,000? Like, what would be the thing where you go? Is anyone going to school for basically free?
Yeah.
Like, how does that work?
So the talent scholarships will range in percentage discount. So you might receive a 50% scholarship off your 50% off your fees, or it could be up to 100% off the fees. And so, like I said, that's as part of the audition process. The panel will sit down and discuss the talent scholarship offerings, and then send those out. So within musical theatre, we have 4 talent scholarships that we give out each year within the cohort of 45.
Many of our students now, and of course, we did this wonderful walk-in with you last year, which was so great. And so a lot of our students are really excited about this possibility. I'd love to kind of hear, come decision time, what are those factors that you feel like you're hearing from students, maybe that makes them decide, oh, I'm not going to go to, it's too much of a leap. I was thinking about it, but now I'm going the other direction. Or what is the thing that makes them go, yes, I'm making this. This is my final decision. I'm making the jump.
Yeah.
What makes it feel like, not specific to our students, but just in general, as you're having that, the decisions back and forth, and they're weighing options, and you're trying to woo them over. What does that discussion go like, and what are those big factors that you feel like are either sealing the deal or making them go, this is actually not the right school for me?
Yeah, for sure. I think the first major point of contention for students is always studying so far away from home. And I guess coming out of COVID, I mean, certainly I'm from Australia. I haven't been able to go home and see my family in nearly 3 years. And so for students that have gone through the pandemic who haven't been able to even see their family that live, as you were saying, maybe just a few states away, that could be a challenging idea to move themselves halfway around the world. I guess on the flip side, though, once they're here, they are surrounded by a community and a family of people that are in the same boat. And so as a result, it's quite a tight-knit community and family at IAB. Everyone's in the same position. The majority of our staff and students are from outside of Spain. So we all sort of understand how everyone's feeling there. So I guess that's probably the first point. The second point is also making sure that they can fund themselves for the 3 years and get through those 3 years of costs. But then when it comes to the actual training and why they end up choosing, I think for those that want an experience, a traditional music theatre training experience, or I use traditional as far as the triple threat training is concerned, but also to be in a group of people that have different perspectives from all over the world, in a country that has a completely different culture and approach, a way of life than most other countries in the world. That's a massive, I guess, learning opportunity, not only for them as individuals at a university, but just for their personal lives, to be able to have 3 years studying in a country away from home, learning a completely new culture. Sometimes they walk away with a new language, but still having that strong MT training. I think that's sort of an opportunity. Certainly if I had the opportunity, if IAB was around when I was studying, I would have jumped at the opportunity to study here.
Well, I am sold. Now I'm excited. We're going to take a little break here. And on the back end of the break, we'll talk a little bit about the audition process for IAB.
Great. Sounds great.
All right, we are back with Nick Hollamby, and we're going to talk about the audition process for IAB. He got us too excited. Now we want to go to the school. We got to get in first. So I'd love to hear just what do you think makes a good audition for you artistically? What are you really looking for as you're assessing a student?
Yeah, great question. And I think this is probably the most common question that I get. And for our students here at the IAB, I love to see who they are, their personalities, because as I mentioned before, for the majority of our students, they are in an ensemble for 3 years with people from all over the world, and they're working together in so many different capacities that I want to make sure that the ensemble works well for the 3 years and that they can get the best out of each other and challenge each other, but also push each other and support each other over the 3 years. So personality and commitment and excitement about studying musical theatre is first and foremost at the top of my list. And then I guess through the audition process, seeing what the skill set is like. Would you like me to jump in and talk about the audition process?
Yeah, please. And I'd love to especially hear about, because anytime I hear ensemble, which I love as a word in terms of what the experience of school will be like, and of course I know that's something that we're looking for, but I'd love to hear how do you sniff out ensemble in what is primarily individual auditions, right? How are you finding, hey, this person seems like they'd play well with others when they're not playing with others? So yeah, tell me all about the audition process.
Yeah, so our audition process is a two-stage process. We have video submissions first. And so as part of the video submission, very much reflective of the majority of the US schools, we ask that students submit 2 contrasting songs. And now a lot of students ask, what should the songs be? There's a suggestion that one is contemporary and one is pre-1965. But essentially, as long as they're contrasting in their vocal styles, I'm all here for it. So 2 contrasting songs, a monologue of 60 seconds from a staged work, so it can be a musical or a play, that's completely fine. And then 60 seconds of dance footage, preferably jazz, but it can be any sort of dance footage. And then finally a wildcard video. A lot of students, the wildcard is optional, but I really encourage anyone applying to put in the wildcard video because I guess that's our first take of personality type. Even in the slates, to give us a little idea of what they're like as individuals is great because that's the first time we sort of get an idea of how they're going to work within that wider ensemble, as we were saying. From there, they're then invited to a second stage process, and that's a live audition. For those in the US freaking out about having to come to Spain, you don't have to come to Spain for the live auditions. They are done on Zoom, and the beauty of the global pandemic showed that we can run really successful live online Zoom auditions. During that audition process, there's a ballet masterclass, a jazz masterclass, and then an interview process where they'll present their songs, their monologue, and then have a chat with the team. I say masterclass because auditions are hard enough to prepare for auditions and that there's enough pressure around them. So we like to treat it more like a class where they get to learn or run through some techniques, learn a routine, get to know the staff, get to know others in the audition process before their one-to-one session. And that's another opportunity for us to see how they engage with both the staff and others in the audition process. We do have students that fly to Europe for the auditions though, because they double it as a holiday. So we do have auditions here in Barcelona, 2 Citrus auditions. We also have auditions in London. We're running them in Stockholm and Dublin as well this year. So, and in Portugal and Lisbon. So there's lots of opportunities if they want to attend the live auditions. And I guess as part of getting an idea for or a feel for what they're like as individuals, the interview process is where we sort of have a nice chat, get to know what they've done in the past, what their aspirations are like, why they want to consider studying halfway around the world, what are their hopes and aspirations, why is Spain a part of that, or IAB I should say. And then we just talk about their love of musical theatre and nerd out for a few minutes, I guess.
That's a beautiful audition process. I've asked this question a couple times too, because it's a newish option, I think, for a lot of our students, and can be a scary one, is like taking class as an audition, especially in this case, a Zoom class. So it's not like you can even just kind of organically interact with the other students because they're all on little boxes and squares. And like, how do you interact well with others? What are you looking for, maybe without making your presence too? Oh gosh, man, Charlie asked 6,000 questions. We get it. Charlie wants to be present, but also not a shrinking violet away from their screen. Like, what are you looking for in that class environment as people are auditioning?
Yeah, at the start, we have an open forum chat so we can answer any questions about the program. So if they've got questions or if they want to ask things about the IAB, there's a really great way to just sort of break the ice. And we have everyone introduce themselves because everyone's stuck in the same Zoom sort of call for a few hours. And then in the masterclass, the faculty will often stop the class and speak to individuals and check up on things. So I guess making sure that students stay engaged. And for our US students, sometimes if they're not involved in the US specific live auditions, for some of them, I know last year we were talking to students at 4 a.m. in the morning when they were doing a ballet masterclass. That's absolute dedication. So from there, we already know that they're definitely interested and dedicated to be in this industry.
Or just insomniacs or something. It could just be
exactly.
But you mentioned some live auditions, but no New York, Chicago, LA live auditions for Unifieds in the...
Not at the moment. That is definitely something on the cards, on the table, I guess, because we've sort of been in this limbo land with the global pandemic, certainly up until the last couple of months of whether flights would go ahead or not. For this year, we're just keeping them within Europe, but that is definitely on the cards for the future.
You mentioned the pre-screen. So especially with that extensive callback process, what are you looking for in the pre-screen? How are you viewing that video? How many times are you viewing that video? I guess I'd love to hear just how you use those pre-screen videos.
Yeah. So for me singing is my first love, I would say. I have danced, but I would never consider myself
I have danced. Just a very specific. I have danced.
I have moved away slightly from that. But so from a singing point of view, I guess you can hear within the first 30 seconds of their 60-second cut what you're looking for when you're auditioning them. But for the monologues, really seeing that they understand the text and they understand the wider play or the musical that the text is from within that 60-second cut, which can be challenging. And then within the dance, just performance. I mean, like I said before, we have extensions. So if people don't have 60 seconds of really technically proficient dance, then I just want to see 60 seconds of joy and connection to character in their 60 seconds of dance, because there is a place for everyone to study musical theatre. I firmly believe that, and to study the performing arts. So just, I guess that's what we're looking for in the pre-screen, that joy and characterization and commitment to what they're doing.
I love it. And then as you're kind of merging those two factors, this is my favorite question to ask everyone, is just how do you weigh in the sort of intangibles of, are you a good ensemble member? Would I want to spend these 3 years with you? How does that weigh in versus, but boy, this person is an incredible singer, or my God, what a good dancer. How are you weighing in the kind of talent versus those intangibles as you're making those final decisions?
Yeah, I guess within the pre-screening, is that what you're referring to?
Well, I mean, a little bit after you've now seen it. So you've seen them do their performances multiple times. You've seen the pre-screens, you've now seen the live audition, and you're making the decision of what are my first offers going to be. How are you factoring in those different factors?
For sure. So in the interview process, we have a number of different questions that we ask, and I try to avoid sort of scripted questions and sort of let it become a little bit more of a natural flowing conversation.
That's a note for me, is what you're saying, Nick, because I keep asking scripted questions.
No,
it's a good note. I'll take it.
I'm loving the questions.
Megan's writing it down. She's like, stop asking questions, Charlie.
So within that sort of, I don't want to say organic, but that organic conversation, it's really interesting to see or hear about the backgrounds of the students and to see what they want. And during that time, you get a pretty, even in that 15-minute conversation, you get a pretty clear indication of what they're like as a person, first and foremost, and their character, and outside of anything to do with musical theatre. And I think it's important, as I said before, if they're studying here in Spain and they're studying musical theatre, that you get an idea for what they're like outside of musical theatre, because musical theatre, yes, is what they want to do, but it's not the be-all and end-all for them. They have to be a person first and foremost. And so getting an idea for what they're like there. So I guess that's, in that process, gives us a pretty clear understanding of how they fit within the ensemble.
I love it. And then what about in the general application process? So obviously, in the US, we would say this is a really conservatory style school, right? Meaning most of the stuff is going to be, like you said, practical. Are you requiring essays and letters of recommendation and grades and all those normal things? And how much do those things then factor in the kind of what we call the academic side of the application? How does that factor in if you go, I love Charlie artistically. Oh, he's so fun to chat with. Everything. But what am I looking at now on the paper side of it?
Yeah, so they do have to achieve university entrance in order to attend the IAB. And then we do ask for, you could call it an expression of interest letter, or just a little, I guess, short essay about themselves. Just a brief overview of what they've done, what they're hoping to achieve. And it's really interesting. I think some people are under the assumption that we sort of just quickly skim read those. But those that take time to really think about what they write in and add something that's engaging, or talk about something that similar to the wild card, I guess, with the first screening, that take that time to really fine-tune their letter towards the institute, they stand out. And they immediately are people that I want to engage with. So that's just something else that I guess we include within that audition pack.
It's something I often say to our students when I'm first meeting them, of like, so much of this process is asking you to continually articulate yourself in the world, right? Like you have to think about it as you think about what material might be right for me. What do I want to say about myself? And you think about it as you write your essays. You think about it as you do your wild card. You think about it in your interviews, right? That happens again and again. How much are you looking for unique and or different thing? Like if I wrote about something in my letter of rec, if I wrote about something in my essay that was really specific, do I then not talk about it in the interview? Is it okay if I talk about it again? If my wild card is on it, are you ever like, oh God, it seems like you're repeating that process? Because it does in some ways feel like they are asked to re-articulate themselves a lot of times of who are you? And you're sort of saying it again in all these different ways. Yeah.
I really encourage students, if they want to, if something comes up in the wild card that we're really interested in, I'll normally bring it up again in the interview process. And same with the expression of interest letter. If there's something that's intriguing, I'll question it in the interview process. But I also appreciate that for a lot of the students at 18 years of age, they've got 18 years of experience that they can fit into. So they don't have to impress us with, trying to make it sound like they've lived 3 lives. We understand they're 18 and having said that, 18-year-olds have packed in so much more than I ever did, I feel like, in my first 18 years. They're amazing. So, yeah, I guess we can unpack that, but they don't have to rewrite the book to impress us for the auditions.
I love it. And then in terms of the different disciplines or the different focuses, whether I'm looking at, I'm a really strong singer, I'm a really strong dancer. How does it work in terms of then your admission when you're talking about scholarships, you're talking about who's going to get in, is it about the top 2 scores of my acting and singing is really strong, I can throw away the dance, or is it, if I'm an amazing dancer, amazing actor, how does that work in terms of, is it one holistic score? Are we super scored? How do you sort of make that decision with the different disciplines?
So I guess if someone is a really strong triple threat performer across all 3 areas, and they could go into either extension, normally because the singing extension is for those, as we were saying before, that might need a little bit more development in their dance. So we'll tend to put them onto those that are really strong triple threats into the dance extension. And that's because we have, apart from the traditional tap, ballet and jazz, we have commercial dance and aerial skills. So they'll learn silks and hoops, and acro skills as part of that. So those that really want to push themselves in dance and develop additional skills while still getting that traditional singing training, that's a really easy pathway for them. But for those that are sort of on the fence, during their induction week or O week, we'll do some more streaming just because the online platform is great, but sometimes we just like to check in after especially if it's been 8 months, just to see where they're at post auditions, because our auditions run, they're opening at the end of November and they'll run right through until August. So we do a check-in at the start of September with them all in the studio. They get to meet the staff and just make sure that we've put them on the right extension pathway.
I'm going to dare to ask you a question about your own personal research, which now, if you're telling me, hey, this is something that's on a website, blah, 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 we can just move on past it. But I'd love to just hear about some of the work that you've been doing in terms of trans vocal learning and also just even that idea of like, what is a global, what does global musical theater look like? All that stuff. I'm so interested in what your own research has been.
So as far as the singing is concerned with voice development, that's been something I've been really interested in. And I guess during my master's, I studied mutational, or the scientific term, mutational change within the changing male voice as males go through adolescence. And so from there, I worked with a number of students that were transitioning during their training, and traditional way of training with female male voices, even in the way it's split in an ensemble setting.
Totally.
Really, I guess when I was first starting out, started to grind my gears because these students who were trying to figure out their own pathway couldn't figure out where they fit within the training system. And so I sort of made it a personal mission of my own to re-look at how we approach singing training for voices. And so I guess using the soprano, alto, tenor, bass, the traditional SATB terminology, made it a little bit more accessible, and looking at how the voice transitions during that period, around whether it's involving medication or if it's a non-medicated transition process, and the impacts on the voice, so students can still feel like they can train during that process without feeling like they have to take a step back for a few years until everything starts to settle, and so they can keep working their voice, keep developing their not only their voice but their personal voice, their expression.
Capital V voice, yeah.
Exactly.
And I'm so interested. I mean, are there medical differences? Like if you choose to transition later in life, so you're going through basically the adolescent process because of taking medicine. Is it affect the voice differently than it would at 13, 14 or whatever, when it might happen otherwise?
Yeah, I think for those that I've worked with that have transitioned earlier, it's certainly, I don't want to say an easier process for the voice to develop, but I think that because everyone through adolescence trains and develops their technique as the voice develops, that transition, the earlier it happens, the easier it is, I guess, for new techniques to be applied and to address it earlier on, as opposed to those that transition later. It can be a little bit more challenging because there are habits and there are muscle memories that need to change. Having said that, I've worked with people in their late 20s who have absolutely smashed it as far as their singing technique is concerned, really embrace it. And it's a challenge, but if they're committed, like any muscle in the body, if you want to if you go to the gym and just work on your legs all the time, and all of a sudden we start to ask you to work on your arms, it's going to take a while, but if you've got the commitment, it will work. Everything's just a muscle in there, and it's just about how you apply different techniques to develop those muscles.
And then what about musical theater for the global market? What does that mean in terms of like, again, I'm so interested. I mean, it seems like musical theater, we think of as such a traditionally American art form. We made it. It's our art form, and we're spreading it out to the world. But, it's so interesting to think. I mean, it is now, of course, lived in enough other countries that it's developing. You're saying, what is the Australian musical theater tradition? Which I'm like, that's so interesting. I have a tiny window into this because my partner was in Jagged Little Pill, which then now the Australian cast was like opening and running while they're like sitting there going, we want to go. So I'm like, oh my God, it's so interesting to see how they just do things a little differently. It's not radically different, but I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, I guess because of, as I was mentioning at the start, I grew up watching these amazing American and UK productions come to Australia and be cast in Australia, and they kept exactly the same format. with little tweaks, whether it's the jokes or things that are more specific to the Australian audiences. But then when I came to IAB, it completely reshaped my thinking about musical theatre, because we'd have students that, as I mentioned before, would come from one of our students from Bulgaria, had listened to Chicago, but had never had the opportunity to see a production of Chicago, and had a very different understanding of what Chicago was about compared to the majority of other students that had seen the production or had studied the American musical theatre art form. And so that perspective, especially in music theatre history classes or in contextual studies, when you're looking at race and diversity within the musical theatre art form, a lot of the discussions that have happened over the last 2 years, especially, or 3 years, I guess, sometimes come as a shock to our students from across Europe, because they've been separated from the traditional music theatre, I guess, the traditional music theatre canon. They're not as familiar with it. And so those perspectives are super exciting to discuss and really refreshing. So I guess...
Meaning they come in without any of those preconceived notions. They're like, anyone
exactly.
can play. This is a voice, all I hear in the thing.
That's right. And sort of watching them recontextualize their thoughts on things, or watching others recontextualize their thoughts on roles and identity within musical theatre. So there's that. And then I guess there's also... from certain countries, we really try to promote, whether it's non-traditional casting or female playwrights, or they have to study songs that are not. So we have female composers, we have composers from the global majority. So students have to really take some time to look outside the box. And for those that are from other countries outside of the UK, the US, Australia, even the repertoire that they bring to the table, sometimes from their own countries, is quite interesting. Whether it's original musical theatre from their country and they translate it into English, but there's so much musical theatre happening in Korea. There's a massive music theatre scene, and I think the more we as artists open up to that, the more our industry can improve and grow and change and adapt. And I think, it's certainly going in a great direction, but I think the more we open to the global perspective, the more exciting it will be.
That's where I think you're very smart to say two contrasting songs and then leave that open to interpretation, as opposed to one pre-1965 Broadway show, another post-1965 Broadway, because it just opens the canon to go, what do you got? What do you think
exactly.
what does your voice do? That's smart. The last question I'll throw is just about parents. We have a lot of parent listeners. And I would love, just in terms of your advice to them, if they're sort of listening for their child, maybe their child's a sophomore or junior, just really kind of starting and looking at all this, as they're going through this process, considering especially maybe some international schools. What advice, if the parent is freaked out going, oh my God, there's already 100 and some schools on the US and I got to do more schools? What would your advice be to those parents?
My advice would be encourage your child embrace your child's decisions, because I think and support your child's decisions, because for us to commit to 3 years of study is a massive undertaking. I appreciate that it's a massive undertaking for not only the student, but also for the parents and the family. But it's a 3-year financial and also situational commitment. And if the child wants to study abroad, or if they want to study a specific school, if that's where the connection is for them, that should come first and foremost, even if it's not the school that you had thought or hoped, or college that you had hoped your child would go to, because I think it's really important that the learner, the student, feels supported and embraced by the institute. It's sort of trying to fit like a square peg in a round hole if you don't support that pathway. For studying abroad, the world is so small now, and we're so connected because of the digital platforms. Even travel post-pandemic is back, and you can be in the States within 8 hours on the East Coast from here. So it may seem like a long way, but the cultural benefits and the experience, the lifelong experience, and the friends that they make. I mean, the students then have holiday places in, 12 different countries once they graduate. So that alone is an amazing experience for the students.
Yeah.
And for our US students, they'll stay for 12 months and do an OE after their studies and travel around Europe to all the different countries, staying in friends' houses. And I think that experience outside of the training is worth its weight in gold.
One bonus question I just forgot to ask you from before. I mentioned at the top, just that 1 year gap year for, so if I'm an 18-year-old and I wanted to maybe do the 1 year program, what does that look like?
Yeah, so the foundation program is essentially to prepare students or keep up their training before they enter the BA. It runs up until the spring break, so it starts in September, runs right through till around April for spring break. And so it's about 22 weeks in total, and it's completely reflective of the BA. So you'll take singing lessons, group singing, dancing, tap, jazz, ballet, commercial. You'll take acting classes. You'll study contemporary and classic texts. You'll have an audition and application module, which prepares you for auditions for BA programs. And it's highly intensive. It's 5 days a week. You're sort of in from 9 till 6 each day. And you're working alongside a dance foundation group as well. So there's a lot of mixing between the two disciplines, between musical theatre and traditional contemporary dance.
And is that also an audition-based program? Would I also be auditioning for the 1 year program?
Yes, same audition process, exactly the same as the BA, just a different interview process because you'll be interviewed by the program leader for the foundation course, as instead of myself.
Cool. Well, for anything else I missed, where should people check out more information? Do we on Instagram? Do we go to the website? What do you feel like is the way to go?
Look, I think to see what we're up to on a regular basis, Instagram, IA Barcelona, at IA Barcelona is the key place to go. And you can see behind the scenes footage of our shows, of our different programs, not just for musical theatre, but for commercial dance, contemporary dance and acting. You can see our foundation work, our master's work. Otherwise, the website for all information regarding fees, audition processes, see what the staff profiles are like, you can go to iabarcelona.com, and that will give you all the information that you need. And
you can get the direct daily euro to dollar translation as it shifts. You can be doing that yourself, on the website. Nick, we so appreciate the time. Thank you. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast. And we'll have to get you over to Spain sometime soon.
You better believe it. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go.
Amazing.
Well, crikey, I hope you enjoyed that interview. I was a bit punchy there, wasn't I? Maybe it was starting off with the New Zealand accent that really put us in a weird place. But I found Nick to be so charming and so fun to chat with, as well as I think a really mature and sober voice in the international musical theater community. They are really working to build that program over there, and it's been so exciting to watch the progress they have made. As far as a takeaway for today, I really liked our discussion of strengths versus weaknesses with the extensions, but I think we covered that idea pretty extensively in the Point Park episode takeaway. So if you want to hear my thoughts on that, you can go to that episode. And of course, I haven't really done a takeaway on the idea of showing your personality through the wild card we talked about today or through those ensemble classes. I did a bit of touching on the interview portion, but I will do something more on that, and I think it'll come up many more times. I'll have many opportunities to do that, though I have a lot to say on that idea. But I thought maybe a practical and maybe more helpful takeaway for this interview would be about international schools and all the considerations you want to think about as you consider attending one of them. I really appreciated how Nick pointed out some of the extra hoops you may have to jump through, right? That it's not all positive. And just like every school has its pros and cons, international schools just have additional pros and additional cons, both, right? We talked about how some of the pros, and they may be obvious, we talk about the cultural experience can be really unique, of course, right? When you talk about diversity within universities, we often use that to kind of focus on racial diversity primarily in America. But when you go to a place like IAB, you have cultural diversity and language diversity that would be unparalleled at an American school. Even that, I think, is worth noting. You'll hear me do kind of pros and cons of all of these. Even that, it's not necessarily an unadulterated good. I mean, I think basically across the board, diversity is a positive thing, especially when you're talking about like avoiding orthodoxy for the long-term health of an institution, that you want to have diverse thought and basically diversity of all kinds. But that said, having students who may not speak English as a first language or who may come from a background where they're not introduced to the basics of the American musical theater canon at a young age, the way many of you are as our listeners, that might mean that the classes progress through learning some of these things a bit slower and maybe a little less rigorously specific as you might get at an American conservatory. Again, for the right student, I think this is a huge plus, right? For a student who wants their cultural artistry expanded and their way of thinking shaped in a beautiful, non-linear way, I think this is all for the good. But for a student who really just wants to focus on how they will work in the American musical theater, this building wider in this way often does mean building less high. That's a little metaphor if you think about I'm all on blocks right now because I have a toddler. So it's if you build it wide, it might not be able to be quite as high. Though, of course, to get really high, you have to start with a wide foundation. Now we're getting into some deep metaphors that have nothing to do with what we're talking about. And of course, this need not necessarily be true, right? Just because you're coming at it from a really interesting wide angle doesn't mean you can't get just as far, but I think in the aggregate, it generally will be. Another big pro, with its con downside, is the cost, right? A lot of European universities, like IAB, have lower total costs. They aren't always subject to the American bloat in the educational system. And if you add a scholarship in there, it can significantly lower the bill on an American education, especially in this case, as is not uncommon with European schools. This is a 3-year program, so it's already a quarter of the costs cut out, even before you talk about the yearly tuition. That said, as Nick mentioned, you got to make sure that the loans you're hoping to use, if you're using loans, or whether it's the special tax-deductible education account that you've put your money into, you got to make sure you're allowed to use that at a non-U.S. institution. This is normally doable, but it's just something that you need to address and figure out of what is possible and, what scholarships you were expecting maybe from the U.S. Are those applicable, et cetera. Similarly, it's worth investigating how each European degree does or doesn't transfer to U.S. institutions if you were to consider grad school. In general, a BA Hons like this should transfer well, but there's a process you have to go through to get it recognized, and especially since this is a conservatory-style arts degree, it may depend on the grad school you're looking at, what they'll accept or not. This is not completely dissimilar to getting a BFA or BM in the US, though for the most part, I'm actually surprised how well they transfer to most grad schools, right? Pending that you might have to take an additional course for some specific grad schools, if it's a medical school, you'll need multiple additional courses. But, in general, that grad schools will accept a BFA or accept a BM, law schools, et cetera. Most schools, you can transfer that. That should still be true with the BA Hons, but it's just worth looking at different European schools. Depending on the path you might want to take, it may be an additional step or something else that you've another hoop you got to jump through. And the last potential pro-con double-sided coin is what we already mentioned in the interview, which is where you'll work afterward. We had Ashley Reyes on the pod, an MTCA alum who went to Lambda and is having a wonderful career in both TV, film, theater, the whole thing. She's currently starring as the female lead of Walker, Texas Ranger, and she's in How I Met Your Father on Hulu. It's awesome, right? So it's absolutely possible to go to school and then work in the US. But it can be tougher and maybe a more circuitous path as opposed to that more traditional U.S. university, into a showcase, into an agent, into a large alumni network situation that especially many of the most competitive U.S. universities can offer you. I've said it before, and I firmly believe that the name value differentiation of different schools is generally overhyped, meaning people put too much importance on the difference between what they perceive as the 9th best school versus the 15th best school in terms of some overarching, list that they think exists out there. But that said, the reason many people get excited about some of those big name schools is that, of course, there is some value to having that strong reputation and alumni network to help you get your foot in the door in this crazy industry. I certainly have had doors open for me because of the name on my degree and alumni connections, and I'm very grateful for it. Now, I would never let that supersede the importance of what is the best fit for me and where am I going to learn the best. I think that is the most important thing, but that's not to say that there isn't any name value or any importance to the connections that you can make in school. That's part of the reason people go to school, is to meet people who will become their collaborators and all the things you hear us talk about in the artist episodes. Speaking of gratitude, even post-Thanksgiving, I am grateful for all of you, our loyal listeners, especially those of you who gave us ratings and reviews wherever you listen. There's still time to do so if you have not done so. You can also hit us with fun questions, suggestions, comments, any other fun stuff you want to get into our mailbag episode by hitting us at mailbag@mappingthecollegeaudition.com. We're going to do that holiday mailbag episode, and we want your participation. You can also follow us on the socials. I'm at Charmer7. We're at MT College Auditions, etc. If you're interested in working with MTCA or hearing more about that junior workshop, head on over to mtca.nyc. To my young artists out there mapping their journeys, never turn down an invite to visit a Spanish beach. We'll see you next week.